Welcome everyone. I'm Pat Camillo, your presenter for this next section of the program titled Stress and Estrogen. So we all experience stress, but you may not have made the connection between stress and estrogen. And I have to tell you, it's really incredibly significant. But first, in order to fully appreciate that connection, I need to do a quick review of the normal stress response and also some of the major glands that are involved, because I'm thinking you probably haven't thought about the physiology behind this in quite a while. And again, I'm not going to go into major depth, just enough to give you a taste and an understanding of what I'm going to be talking about. So then I'll discuss what happens when the stress response gets out of whack. And most importantly, how estrogen is involved in all of this. Okay, so stress. It's hard to live with it. It's impossible to live without it. And that goes for all of us. Our bodies have a pretty good system in place for handling stress, but when it becomes chronic, it can break the whole system down. So a stress response that's out of whack is one of the most common underlying problems related to mental health disorders. On the upside, once you understand how our bodies deal with stress, you can learn to manage it so much better and hopefully help others do the same. And of course, one of the key players here is estrogen. But before I go there, I need to share again some basic stuff with you so everything else is going to make sense. Your graphic shows you that there are 3 glands in your body that are very much involved in managing stress. It's the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenals. Just an aside, I recently learned that hypothalamus is Greek for seahorse. Why I chuckle when I say this is because if you know anything about the reproductive tract of a seahorse, it's kind of funny. So now you have something to go Google. Okay, so getting back to the story. Everyone always picks on the adrenal glands, and they use phrases like adrenal fatigue, which is really a made-up medical diagnosis, and honestly, it drives me nuts when I hear it. Because actually, the head conductor for this whole orchestra of events is the hypothalamus, and that's where the real story begins. So, the hypothalamus, as you could see in this graphic, and I love this slide, it really does show you clearly what these glands look like and where they're located. It's a really small gland found at the base of your brain. It has a hand in regulating your metabolism, growth, immune function, and even some elements of activity in your gut, your heart, your kidneys even. So clearly, even though it's very small, it has a lot of power. In fact, it even plays a role in regulating your body temperature. Hello, hot flashes. We'll talk more about this in a bit. So when it senses that you're running low on certain hormones, it'll send out what's called releasing factors to help get more of these hormones into the bloodstream. One really important releasing factor that has to do with managing stress is called the corticotropin releasing factor, or CRH for short. CRH is sent down from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which, if you remember, is located right under the hypothalamus in the brain. So it doesn't need to go very far. It travels on a specific highway of veins and nerve impulses that exist between these 2 glands. The pituitary gland is often called the master gland because it secretes so many hormones that have to do with many different functions in our body. But actually, it gets its order from the hypothalamus. So once again, I really think that gland should get more respect. But okay, so once the pituitary gets CRH, it produces and secretes adrenal corticotrophic hormone, or ACTH. When researchers study these hormones in rats, they found that the females have a much more robust production of ACTH than males. And that's an important difference, because that might have something to do with why a woman has a stronger response than a man to a similar situation. But getting back to our story, the pituitary releases ACTH into the bloodstream, leaving the brain now and heading south to the adrenal glands. These glands, as you probably know, there are two of them. They sit each on each kidney, one on each kidney. Each one has two parts that produce some really important compounds that help us to deal with stress. Under the influence of ACTH from the pituitary, the adrenal medulla produces epinephrine and norepinephrine. But the real heavy hitter for stress is produced in the adrenal cortex, and that's cortisol. So normally cortisol is controlled in your body by a binding protein. It's a molecule. This binding protein is a molecule that will grab cortisol in the bloodstream and prevent it from having any effect on you. So whenever a hormone gets bound with one of these binding proteins, that hormone is no longer free to enter and act on cells throughout the body. Thankfully, most of our cortisol actually ends up bound and inactive, and only about 5 to 10% is usually available. But as small as that percentage is, it's incredibly powerful. Another interesting tidbit to throw in the mix here is that cortisol increases with age. So although premenopausal women show lower mean levels of cortisol than men of the same age, probably because they have more estrogen, during the menopausal transition, cortisol levels increase, again, because they have lower levels of estrogen. And as you can imagine, this could have really important consequences, especially in regards to anxiety, which is what we'll cover in the next section. Cortisol does have a really bad reputation. It gets blamed for so many things. On Instagram, everyone is always looking for ways to lower their cortisol, but we absolutely need cortisol. It helps us to fight infections and inflammation. We need cortisol in order to survive. If you're being attacked by a bunch of piranhas, you really want to have this hormone on board, right? It initiates the fight or flight response, and that includes a whole bunch of different actions in the body to help us to do battle. If you look at your slide, it'll break it down for you. It takes the protein, turns it into sugar to give you energy. It takes your fat and converts it to usable energy. It increases blood flow to your skeletal muscles, so you have the strength and the energy to run or fight. It actually decreases blood flow to your gut, because at the end of the day, your gut is going to be pretty useless in these situations, right? That's also kind of interesting when you think about women under stress and how their gut is reacting to that stress. In the short term, cortisol can be anti-inflammatory, making you strong and tough. Now, I know that sounds all very intense, but one good thing is that once cortisol is released, it also then sends a message back to the hypothalamus telling it that it can cool it. We've got this under control, at least for this episode. And that's a very important negative feedback system, because that stops the production of cortisol. Now, the stress response is a very highly fine-tuned, tightly coordinated system. Autonomic nervous system is involved. The neuroendocrine system is involved. It helps us to maintain balance or homeostasis. But when stress becomes chronic and it maladaptive, we end up with hyperactive, out of control cortisol responses, and that can lead to mood and anxiety disorders, including major depressive disorder. So, where does estrogen fit in all of this? You may be wondering. So, remember the slide with all the areas of the brain that are densely populated with estrogen receptors? Well, many of those areas in the brain are intimately involved in the stress response. And so they have a very strong connection and relationship with estrogen. And that's where estrogen comes into play. There are also some gender differences, a whole Mars-Venus thing going on in response to stress. We won't get into the cultural or social pieces to that puzzle. But one physiologic piece has to do with the size of the neurons in the hypothalamus. Women, it seems, has larger neurons than men, and because they have larger neurons in their hypothalamus, they end up releasing more corticotropin releasing hormone in response to stress, which leads to more ACTH being released from the pituitary and ultimately more cortisol from the adrenal glands. Another thing that makes our response different from men's is, of course, our hormones. And in women, when stress hormones are elevated, it definitely impacts our reproductive hormones. I love this slide. It's a great slide because it shows the parallel relationship between the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary axis, and the HPG axis, the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. In addition to its involvement in the stress response, the hypothalamus is also responsible for starting the menstrual cycle. And this will be a little bit of a review for you, but amazing to me how many nurses actually never really grasped this when they were in school. So I bet, many women for sure think it all starts in the ovary, but actually it all starts in the brain. When the hypothalamus gets the message that estrogen levels are low, such as on the first day of your period, it releases what's called the gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, another releasing hormone. Just like CRH, it ends up at the pituitary gland. The pituitary then releases two very important hormones to kickstart a woman's menstrual cycle: the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. These two hormones leave the brain and head into the bloodstream south to the ovaries. So there's a long history of clinical research that connects HPA axis and HPG axis dysregulation in the development of mood disorders. And so the reason I'm sharing this with you now is because I'll be referencing these very systems as we go through the program. Just to give you a little taste, there are population studies that strongly tie ovarian dysfunction to major depressive disorder. In fact, it's been found to be present even before the onset of an episode for this disorder. When estrogen levels are drawn in patients in an episode of depression, they often have abnormal estrogen and FSH levels. There are also reports that women with major depressive disorder are at an increased risk of early menopause, largely because their estrogen levels are low. Some researchers have raised the possibility that ER expression, estrogen receptor expression, is maybe downregulated in stress circuitry regions within the brain. And so in women with major depressive disorder, it might be causing sort of a blunting effect in terms of estrogen's actions, since those receptors are downregulated. But this is not fully understood yet, and there's still a whole lot that we need to learn. But I did find some interesting research that looks at women's brains using MRI imaging. So when brain imaging is done on healthy women, premenopausal women, their response to a mild stress challenge, they often do this showing pictures, and it's valid and tested kind of procedure that I won't get into the details, you just have to trust me on. It's different depending on where they are in their menstrual cycle, their stress response. So at points in the cycle when estrogen is low or was low, their response to stress was heightened, more so than during times in the cycle when their estrogen was higher. And that's when they were able to handle the stress challenge much better. So the researchers could know this for sure because they were actually looking at their brains through this imaging. There's even more documented interaction between the HPG and the HPA axis. So, for example, when cortisol levels get too high, it causes the hypothalamus to block the release of GnRH, which then never has a chance to get to the pituitary to release the luteinizing hormone and the follicle stimulating hormone. This is how stress can interfere with ovulation. Cortisol can also interfere in the ovaries directly by getting in the way of eggs maturing. And we've seen this in women who are struggling with infertility and who have major stresses as a result. It can actually backfire for them. And so research is showing that mindfulness strategies really can make a huge difference in that population. So these kinds of things are actually consequences that are most often and usually seen only when stress is chronic. That being said, unfortunately, that's all too often in women these days. So, in summary, here's the takeaway message. Low levels of estrogen are going to make us less able to handle chronic stress well. So I hope that gave you a little bit more insight into how stress and estrogen interact with each other. And I'll close now, and we'll be moving on to the next section, which I believe will be looking at anxiety and estrogen. And I'll see you in a bit.